Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. I want to share some of my thoughts on Pink Floyd, definitely one of the legacy bands of rock music history. I'm going to just give some of my personal remembrances of growing up around a lot of Pink Floyd. I want to talk a little bit about David Gilmour's awesome guitar playing, and then end with some of my thoughts on the David Gilmour versus Roger Waters saga. So I hope you'll consider watching. Well, there aren't that many advantages to being older, maybe a few, hopefully, but one of the advantages is that you can start to remember things. And so I've listened to Pink Floyd a long time. This was the first Pink Floyd album I ever had. This was really kind of one of the main Pink Floyd's albums I bought. And this is, of course, Wish You Were Here. And I bought that in ninth grade. So this is a copy I've had for years. I also have, I've picked up some other copies over the years. About 20 years ago, you could still find these albums at flea markets and things. I think it's getting harder to do, but this is Obscured by Clouds. And I've got two copies of Animals. By the way, if you ever see Quadrophenia, that building is on the booklet of Quadrophenia, which is kind of cool. I forget what it's called. But at any rate, Wish You Were Here was the album I bought. But of course, Pink Floyd was on the radio all the time. And I had a lot of friends that played Pink Floyd. So, I mean, I actually know Dark Side of the Moon, I think, as well or better than Wish You Were Here. And I've never really owned a copy just from playing. And I used to play, when I would play in bands, we would jam on different Pink Floyd songs sometimes to please the crowd a little bit. But... one thing I wanted to say about that is I remember when Pink Floyd was a very kind of countercultural group. I guess they still are, but it's almost can't go back to that period and really remember how countercultural and kind of psychedelic they were and out of the mainstream. So today they're so famous, they seem kind of like pop stars or something, but they certainly weren't then. They were kind of a druggy band, or they were perceived that way anyway. I don't know if they were, but they were perceived that way. Very trippy, doing kind of weird stuff. And I remember my friend's older brother had Dark Side of the Moon, and at that time you didn't really hear it much. So that's kind of interesting. I think Dark Side of the Moon is kind of like Layla or Dream On by the Aerosmith, or some other groups you might think of, that it became more famous as time went on, because there's some songs that, make a big splash when they first come out and then they kind of disappear. And some of the really good songs are kind of released, and then they kind of build momentum, and they over decades, they kind of keep getting more and more famous. Stairway to Heaven's like that. Anyway, Dark Side of the Moon was definitely like that. I remember my friend's older brother had a copy, and it was just really cool to hear. And it was a very esoteric kind of rare collection he had. He had all kinds of albums that definitely weren't, of the mainstream. And I remember he also played a Sonata Hoople, and that seemed so cool, and it was something you didn't hear on the radio much. So I remember when Pink Floyd was kind of like that. The other memory I have of Pink Floyd is there used to be a theater by our house, and they would play midnight movies. I don't know if they have midnight movies anymore. Of course, Rocky Horror Picture Show would be one quintessential favorite of the midnight movie crowd. But they would show the Cream farewell concert and things like that. I remember seeing Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones, in that theater. But they used to show Pink Floyd live at Pompeii quite a bit. So I saw that several times at this little movie theater, Pink Floyd live at Pompeii. And that was great because that also gives you a sense of Pink Floyd before they were really the household names. And that Pink Floyd live at Pompeii was filmed before Dark Side of the Moon came out. So I don't know when it was released, but it was filmed before Dark Side of the Moon came out. Now that film, they kind of splice in some scenes. You can see them in the studio recording Dark Side of the Moon, and there's that kind of Back to the Future moment. I think they're playing Brain Damage, and the world has never heard it yet, but you can kind of see them working on it a little in the studio. But mostly that movie is all their earlier stuff, and so I saw that movie quite a few times in this theater, and I've watched it. It's readily available now on YouTube and streaming and everything. But that's great because that really shows kind of at their peak, the old Pink Floyd, that kind of went back to the days of Syd Barrett. There's a scene where they're recording a dog howling. Roger Waters just beats the hell out of a gong in one song. It's got Careful with That Axe, Eugene, and Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. A lot of that old kind of psychedelic Pink Floyd. And it also has those really long jams. I think Echoes is on there, which is a big long jam, which is kind of a early version of Breathe. So they kind of ripped themselves off to do Breathe. And I heard when they used to do Echoes, that's E minor to A, if any of you are interested in guitar, and they would play that for 45 minutes. And then they kind of trimmed it all up for Dark Side of the Moon, which is kind of a good lesson in songwriting and also letting things evolve kind of organically. So they had all those kind of wild jams, which you can see in that movie, Pink Floyd live at Pompeii. And then I think Dark Side of the Moon kind of took the gems and all the best moments and kind of packaged everything a little better without making it commercial. And produced one of the great albums of all time, I think produced by Alan Parsons, right? I say Dark Side of the Moon wasn't commercial, which is sort of an ironic thing to say since it's probably one of the biggest grossing albums in the history of music and biggest selling. But it wasn't a commercial album, really, but it was kind of packaged and smoothed out, and a lot of the excesses and self-indulgence that you might see in that Pink Floyd Live at Pompeii movie were kind of removed, and the songs were done with somewhat more discipline, and they're just great. So that. So and it took you back to the Syd Barrett days. I hadn't heard too much of the Syd Barrett stuff, I have to be honest. Now, that older brother I was mentioning, I'm sure he had the Syd Barrett stuff in his record collection. I do remember one time I was visiting my friend in college, and he said, "You want to hear some of the Syd Barrett with Pink Floyd?" And I never really had, so I think I was maybe 19 or 20 at this time, so this would probably be like 80, 81, something like that. And so he put on, it was probably Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I don't even really remember, but it was the Syd Barrett Pink Floyd stuff. And I remember not liking it too much. And I think that's another thing that I wanted to say is that early Pink Floyd was kind of trippy and interesting. There were a lot of weird concepts and kind of quirky songs and psychedelic stuff. Kind of reminded me of maybe like Strawberry Alarm Clock, like psychedelic pop. I don't know if it was that good actually, but it was good. But you could kind of see how important it is that the band evolved beyond that kind of psychedelic pop band to what they became in the 70s. That also takes me to my next point, which is Gilmour's guitar playing, because, of course, that early version of Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett added David Gilmour, and he played with Syd Barrett for a little while, and then Syd Barrett was having his breakdowns and so on, and they pretty much just replaced Syd Barrett with David Gilmour. And I kind of wanted to say a little bit about David Gilmour's playing, because I think that shows how important he is to Pink Floyd. Now, the whole band is great. That's a great lineup, not taking anything away from Roger Waters in particular, but also Nick Mason and Richard Wright. But it was David Gilmour's guitar, especially as it kind of worked its way into their music, that really added that epic quality, that kind of body buzz, that kind of Grand Canyon sound. That was what Pink Floyd became, and that owes to Gilmour. I don't think you would have had the same band without David Gilmour. You take David Gilmour out of Pink Floyd, it's not the same band. It's that epic Grand Canyon quality, and you can see it in that live Pink Floyd at Pompeii movie, but it really kind of came of its own on Dark Side of the Moon. And I think that's such an important point, and I think that's one thing about David Gilmour is he was a good guitar player. I think he actually kind of had roots in folk music and just kind of rock. Maybe if he'd hooked up with another band, he would have been a great guitar player in another style. If he'd ended up in a rockabilly band, we'd today consider him some sort of a rockabilly guitarist. But he got in this Pink Floyd, and he was a young man, and his style kind of developed. He developed this kind of epic Grand Canyon style of playing, which has just become one of the great, most distinctive classic rock sounds in the history of music. Just awesome. And you can never take that away. I don't think without David Gilmour there would be a Pink Floyd, and I'm not sure I'd say that about that. Everybody's replaceable, but I don't know about David Gilmour. His guitar was an X factor in that band that you just cannot replace. Another thing I kind of wanted to say about that is I remember when in the 70s, this was well before the 80s and MTV, and I think in a weird way, Pink Floyd got more famous, in that period, even though that wasn't really their roots. But I do remember in the 70s, Gilmour wasn't one of the really big guitar heroes. If you think of like these rock star guitar heroes, the people I remember talking to thought he was cool because he played slow, quote unquote slow. He's a very technically proficient guitar player. It's not like there are all these things he can't do, but he did kind of play this soulful, slow phrasing with a lot of emotion. And I remember a lot of people thought that was pretty cool, but it also kind of flew under radar, at least in terms of focusing on guitar, because the big guitar players back then were like Joe Perry, Foghat, Rod, Jimmy Page, and with a lot of stuff like all that. I didn't really call it shredding back then, but he didn't do that. So he kind of flew under the radar. Today he's probably listed usually in the top handful of guitar players of rock music history. And in the 70s, I wouldn't say that people necessarily thought of him that way. And it's another good example how their legacy's kind of grown as the greatness of what they did kind of sunk into the culture. The other thing I kind of wanted to say is his sound is great. So, I play guitar, and maybe some of you do, and everybody wants to sound like David Gilmour. I have this Keeley Dark Side pedal, which is kind of even supposedly to help you at least sound like David Gilmour. Of course, you need his brain and his fingers. But one interesting thing about that, his sound is actually kind of simple. I heard him say once, everybody always thinks, he must have had all these racks, and I'm sure they had a lot of fancy equipment, but really he said his sound was basically fuzz and delay and loud. Some other things, they use phase shifters on some songs, or probably univibes and things, but the main part of his sound was fuzz, delay, and don't forget loud. And that's the one thing I think when we look at his sound and talk about gear and how do you set this and how do you set that, you can't ever totally replace playing really loud, particularly in a big room. So you take a good fuzz and delay, and then you add loud. That's the Gilmour sound, but don't ever forget that being loud is a big, important part of his sound. And it gives you that kind of epic Grand Canyon feel that's just, so one of the great guitar sounds in the history of the instrument, the Strat. It was fuzz, delay, and loud. And I sometimes think when I see all these gear reviews on YouTube, and I watch them, they're all good, better than I can do, frankly, most of them. But the one thing I think sometimes people forget is how important it is to be loud, particularly if you have a tube amp. That's where you get that classic rock sound. And it's hard to emulate that at lower volumes, no matter how good your digital gear is. So, there's something about moving the air in the room when you're loud like that. And he's just a great guitar player. And it's his phrasing, it's his emotion. But I also, like I said, I also remember when people didn't necessarily, his name didn't always come up when people talk, like, the great guitar players of the 70s, Hendrix, Jimmy Page. His name was often mentioned by people who really like music, but it wasn't one of the household names of great rock guitar players. It was there was a kind of a cult following, and over time that sort of changed. The final thing I wanted to say was on the David Gilmour, Roger Waters thing, and I guess that's kind of what I was just saying, really, is you can't ever take away what David Gilmour brought to that band, which is the physicality of that blues rock element that he added to the music. If old Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett was kind of trippy, psychedelic, interesting, quirky, David Gilmour added beer and a buzz, body buzz, and just that epic sound, and you can never take that away from him. Roger Waters left the band in 1985. They had a legal dispute, I think, about the use of the name, which Roger Waters didn't originally think that Pink Floyd would be able to use the name without him. And I could see that making Roger Waters mad, but I guess the court said that Gilmour, Wright, and Mason could go ahead and continue on as Pink Floyd. Whoever... I don't know, was Wright? He was out of there for a while, but anyway. And so there was money involved. Of course, Roger Waters probably done pretty well because no matter what happens to Pink Floyd, whether he's in or out, he's still the writer on all those songs. I'm sure makes royalties up the wazoo. But it was a painful thing. But I read this book by Nick Mason, and it's a big, long... use it as a paperweight or a doorstop book. But it's actually pretty interesting if you've got a long, I don't know, it's not the kind of book you'd want to read on an airplane, I was going to say, but it's too long, really. But anyway, he goes through that some. And one of the things he says is that Roger Waters didn't really respect David Gilmour. He just thought it was all about kind of cool lyrics, interesting concepts, kind of quirky. And I think you see that with some of his music. He's always done great stuff when he was with other great players. He did that Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking with Eric Clapton. But he didn't really respect what Gilmour brought to the band, because I guess Gilmour wasn't always running around trying to come up with all these philosophical concepts and all these kind of existential angst songs. Just wanted to play some rock and roll, so to speak. And Roger Waters didn't really respect that. And I think that's too bad. You could say it's a personality problem. I think my take on it is that, the two men might just sort of have personal differences and had managed to bury them for a long time, and got along pretty well when the band was starting and everything, it sounds like. And I think they're amicable today somewhat. But Nick Mason does say that Roger Waters didn't really respect David Gilmour's contributions to the band, and that's a pretty glaring oversight. If that's true, I don't know if that's true or not. But if he can't find it in himself to acknowledge that those main albums, and really just the Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals, and The Wall, and I personally think The Wall lacked some of the input of the other band members. But if Roger Waters can't find it in his heart to acknowledge or doesn't understand how important Gilmour was to the success of those albums, then I could see that being a real source of friction. And it's not just ego necessarily. Gilmour's guitar is absolutely centerpiece to that band. Great lyrics, great concepts, But you take away what Gilmour offered to that band, it's not the same. It's definitely. Well, I just wanted to share those thoughts. Pink Floyd was kind of hard to talk about. I kept rambling, and it was, and I didn't know exactly what I wanted to say. But they're such a great band, and they've influenced me. I hope you'll consider watching some of my Pink Floyd jams I did with Now You Shred, or some of the acoustic stuff I did, because I've definitely enjoyed playing Pink Floyd in my own limited way over the years, and definitely hats off to a great band, and especially David Gilmour, who, as time has gone by, has cemented his reputation as one of the great guitar players in the history of the instrument, no doubt, in any genre, and especially in rock music. And I hope everybody realizes that, including Mr. Waters. I have respect for all of them, and, I guess the cop-out thing would be to say they all added. But you know what? Gilmour, to me, is the heart of that sound, actually. David Gilmour was the heart of that sound. Thanks. God bless.